The Trojan War didn't end with clashing swords. It ended with a giant wooden horse, and the man who thought of it was Odysseus. He wasn't the strongest warrior in ancient Greece, but he was easily the smartest. His goal was incredibly simple: sail 12 ships and 600 men straight across the sea to his wife in Ithaca, a voyage that should have taken 2 weeks. Instead, it took 10 years, and not a single man made it home alive. The disaster started in a cave. Odysseus and his men were trapped by a man-eating cyclops. True to his reputation, Odysseus used his intellect to survive. He got the giant drunk, blinded him with a burning stake, and told him his name was Nobody. When the other cyclopsy heard the screaming and asked who was hurting him, Polyphemus yelled, "Nobody is hurting me," and they walked away. It was a brilliant escape, but as his ship sailed safely away, Odysseus couldn't stand being anonymous. His ego demanded credit. He stood at the front of his ship and shouted his real name, his father's name, and his title as King of Ithaca back at the blinded giant. Because he doxed himself, the Cyclops knew exactly who to pray to for revenge. Polyphemus called upon his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. By opening his mouth to brag, Odysseus turned a physical voyage into a decade-long divine punishment for his own arrogance. The ocean itself became an active, hostile enemy. Poseidon ensured the fleet was constantly hammered by storms and blown off course. On the island of Aea, the danger turned inward. Odysseus sent a scouting party into the palace of a witch named Circe. She welcomed them with a feast, but as they ate, she touched them with her wand, instantly turning every man into a pig. Odysseus used a divine herb to resist her magic, but he completely failed the subsequent test of comfort. He succumbed to a life of luxury and wasted a full year on the island, only leaving because his men finally had to remind him they were supposed to be going home. To get back on track, he had to navigate past the sirens. These creatures sang customized songs of temptation, promising whatever a sailor desired most in order to lure their ships to crash against the rocks. Odysseus ordered his crew to plug their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear the song, but he instructed them to tie him tightly to the ship's mast. He wanted to hear the music, knowing full well he wouldn't have the willpower to resist it on his own. Odysseus screamed and begged his men to untie him, but they kept rowing. By forcing his crew to restrain him, he had successfully outmaneuvered his own impulses. This diagram illustrates the horrific strategic choice he faced. The fleet entered a narrow strait, trapped between Charybdis, a massive whirlpool, and Scylla, a 6-headed monster. He intentionally steered towards Scylla, mathematically sacrificing 6 of his best men to save the rest of the crew.
But even that sacrifice wasn't enough. Stranded and starving on the island of Thrinacia, his desperate crew finally broke. While Odysseus slept, they disobeyed his strict orders and slaughtered the sacred cattle of the sun god. The punishment was absolute. As soon as they set sail, Zeus split the ship in half with a thunderbolt. Every single member of the crew drowned, leaving Odysseus entirely alone. Stripped of his army, his ships, and his pride, Odysseus washed up on the island of the nymph Calypso. The great mastermind of the Trojan War spent the next 7 years sitting on a beach, weeping at the horizon, completely powerless. After 20 years of war and wandering, the gods finally intervened. A neighboring king gave him a ship, and Odysseus stepped onto the shores of Ithaca. But his home was a war zone of a different kind. Over 100 wealthy, predatory men from surrounding islands had occupied his palace. They were drinking his wine, eating his food, and aggressively pressuring his wife, Penelope, to marry one of them so they could take his throne. The old Odysseus might have rushed through the gates, shouting his name and demanding his crown. Instead, he accepted the goddess Athena's help to disguise himself as a frail old beggar. He walked into his own home and let the suitors mock him, throw food at him, and treat him like garbage. He watched them abuse his household, but he mastered his ego, kept his mouth shut, and waited for the perfect opening. Penelope finally announced a contest to break the stalemate. She declared she would marry whoever could string Odysseus's incredibly heavy bow and shoot a single arrow clean through 12 axe heads.
One by one, the arrogant suitors stepped up. Not a single one of them could even bend the wood. Then the old beggar asked for a turn. As the room laughed, he took the bow, strung it effortlessly, fired the arrow through the targets, and then turned the weapon on the men occupying his home. With the suitors defeated, Penelope had one final psychological test. She didn't recognize her husband right away, so she ordered a servant to move the king's bed out of their room. Odysseus flared with anger, demanding to know how that was possible, since he had personally carved one of the bedposts out of a living olive tree still rooted in the ground. That intimate, grounded knowledge was the answer she was looking for. Nobody else knew how that bed was built. After 2 decades of war, curses, and monsters, the king and queen were finally reunited. The Odyssey has endured for nearly 3 millennia because it places the greatest danger within the hero himself. It serves as a warning that the most brilliant person in the room can lose everything the moment they lose control of their own pride.